Hello, everybody. Welcome to the historical and political background of the New Testament. Last video, we looked at the time between the Old and New Testament. This time around, we're going to fast forward ahead more to the beginning of the Roman Empire. So we kind of ended with that last time around. We're looking now at the immediate backdrop to the beginning of the New Testament. So we ended with this picture actually last time, and this is a picture of Pompey's siege of Jerusalem and his slaughter of the priests during their temple duties. So this happened mid-60s BC. The Roman general Pompey laid siege to Jerusalem, slaughtered a lot of the priests. Really a violent, bloody beginning to Roman rule in Jerusalem. Julius Caesar, though, is maybe a more familiar name than Pompey. And Julius Caesar actually is a rival general during a civil war of sorts, defeats Pompey to become the sole dictator of the Roman Republic at the time. However, mid-40s BC now, Caesar is assassinated by two Roman senators, or at least led by two Roman senators, named Brutus and Cassius. So even though he had risen through the ranks, even though he had a lot of popular support of the people who didn't like how corrupt the Senate seemed to have become, the Senate, of course, is not too happy that Julius Caesar had taken it upon himself to become dictator, and so he is assassinated. This leads, though, to another clash, another civil war of sorts. So on one side, you've got Brutus and Cassius, the guys who had led the assassination of Julius Caesar. On the other side, you have supporters of Julius Caesar, who is now dead, Mark Antony and Octavian. And there were more people involved than that, but just to simplify it, we'll go with the two-on-two scheme here. Mark Antony and Octavian defeat Brutus, Cassius, and their supporters. They are victorious. However, neither of them are content with ruling over just part of the Roman Republic anymore, and so they, former friends, now enemies, turn on each other and face off against each other for control of everything. And Octavian ends up becoming victorious. This is 31 BC, the Battle of Actium. He becomes the ruler. Previously, he had already been called Caesar in honor of it was his great uncle and his adopted father. Julius Caesar had actually designated Octavian as his heir. And he is also now renamed Augustus. So the Roman Republic, by this point in time, had become, for the first time, the Roman Empire. What had begun as a republic was now an empire, and Caesar Augustus, the new name for Octavian, was now the first emperor. So this is, again, 31 BC or so. Jesus is born 4 BC, likely. I know that sounds weird. We usually think of 0 as Jesus' birth, but actually it was around 4 years before that. The person who had originally come up with that timeline was a little off. At any rate, for the next 25 years or so, Rome has become an empire. And so when Jesus is born, this is the situation. Herod the Great, moving to the Jewish rulers during this time now. Herod the Great was known as the King of the Jews. He was basically, though, a puppet king that had been placed under the ultimate authority of Rome. So he was in charge of Judea, it was called at the time, but Rome, they were really the boss. And he was known for his building achievements. You see here the expansion, a model at least, of the expansion he made to the temple that had been rebuilt centuries before during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So very notable for that, but also very notorious for his cruelty, his vanity. He was not very well liked by his Jewish subjects. He ends up actually killing members of his family because he's paranoid that they're going to threaten his throne. So not a very well-beloved person. And when he dies, there is actually a big uprising among Jews that for so long had resented his rule under the Roman authority ultimately. And that uprising takes place in this city here, Sepphoris, so part of Galilee, the region where Jesus grows up and does much of his ministry. Big uprising that ultimately is unsuccessful. The Romans get involved. Thousands of Jewish soldiers, people that have participated in this rebellion, are crucified. Many are sold into slavery. Just a vicious crackdown. And I put up here for you a picture of a Palestinian boy, actually, from just a few years ago, seeing the wreckage of a building here, possibly his home, after an Israeli airstrike. And so just to give you an idea of, imagine for a minute maybe little Jesus growing up as a boy in Galilee, in Nazareth, the hometown where he grew up, just to the south of this city that a few years before had experienced the wrath of Rome. And so you got to think of that being in the mind of Jesus and influencing him as he grows up and eventually begins his ministry. After Herod the Great's death and after that big uprising, Rome actually oversees a division of Herod the Great's kingdom. It's broken up into 3 sections, one for each of his 3 sons. So Herod Archelaus rules over Judea, Samaria here, Herod Antipas, Galilee and Perea, and then Philip rules over the eastern lands east of the Jordan River here. Now, Herod Archelaus, actually very cruel as well, not liked at all, and he's actually banished by Rome in 6 AD. And his territory comes under direct Roman rule. Judea, Samaria become one Roman province ruled by a Roman prefect. And by 26 AD, shortly before Jesus begins his adult ministry, Pontius Pilate is the one in charge. And that's a name that I hope you're familiar with. We'll certainly see him come up near the end of Jesus' life in the Gospels. So just kind of keeping track briefly of all the different Herods in the Gospels then. Matthew 1 and 2, you've got Herod the Great mentioned. Herod the Great is the one who tries to kill baby Jesus after the wise men come to him and tell him, hey, there's another king of the Jews that's just been born. After Herod the Great dies, Joseph takes Mary, Jesus, back from Egypt to Nazareth instead of Bethlehem because he feared, Matthew tells us, Archelaus, that son of Herod the Great, who was ruling there in place of his father Herod. Later in the Gospels, as we said, Jesus is mainly in Galilee. Matthew 14, Mark 6, Luke 9 all tell the story of Herod Antipas this time. Having John the Baptist imprisoned and then executed. And it's Herod Antipas as well, who later in Luke 22 questions Jesus after Pilate sends Jesus to him on trial. So to wrap up here, there are 3 different approaches that I want to have us look at that many Jews had. 3 different options for how do we handle the Romans? How do we try to practice our faith and hold out hope that God is going to rescue us and bring his kingdom here to earth in light of the empire that's ruling over us? The first one, the Essenes, or the Zealots. Their attitude is basically this: God crushed our enemies in the past, right? The Egyptians, nothing. Canaanites, gone. Assyrians, Babylonians, Greeks, eventually all defeated. Well, why not Rome today? Let's revolt. Let's violently try to resist them, and eventually God and God's Messiah are going to help us in that cause. The Pharisees, one of Jesus's main opponents in the Gospels, or the teachers of the law, they focus on the Torah, the law especially. That's what makes us unique and special as God's people, they say. So maybe if we focus harder on obeying all of these instructions and our traditions that have come up around them as best as we can, maybe that's when God will break the silence. The Sadducees, the temple authorities, it's useless, they say, to try and resist the most powerful empire ever on earth. So let's try to get along with them as best as possible so that we can have our worship at the temple continue. If we rebel, Rome's going to destroy us. Rome's going to annihilate us. And we are going to lose our limited control we have as priests over the rest of the people at the temple. They also, interestingly, more on this later in the Gospels, do not believe in any resurrection of the dead. They don't want, their motivation, I think, here for not believing is they don't want a new age where they are going to lose their power over the people. So no resurrection of the dead. We're in charge in this world. You die and that's it. We only accept the Torah and the law. Also, interestingly, the Sadducees did not accept the prophets or the writings. And then Jesus' way. Non-violent resistance to the ways of Rome, loving your enemies, following God from the heart, victory and forgiveness coming through death and through his resurrection. This is how Jesus says the kingdom comes. And this is not a way that a whole lot of people in Jesus' day are prepared to hear. And that's what makes his message unique.